Bronze Age swords appear from around the 17th century BC in the Black Sea region and the Aegean. As a further development of the dagger, they are replaced by the Iron Age sword during the early part of the first millennium BC. From an early time the swords reach lengths in excess of 100 centimeters. The technology to produce blades of such lengths appears to have been developed in the Aegean, using alloys of copper and tin or arsenic. Around 1700 BC, typical Bronze Age swords had lengths of roughly between 60 and 80 centimeters, while weapons significantly shorter than 60 centimeters also continued to be made, but are variously categorized as short swords or as daggers. Before 1400 BC or so, swords remain mostly limited to the Aegean and southeastern Europe, but they become more widespread in the final centuries of the second millennium, to Central Europe and Britain, to the Near East, Central Asia, northern India and to China. Predecessors. Before bronze, stone was used as the primary material for edged cutting tools and weapons. Stone, however, is very fragile, and therefore not practical to be used for swords. With the introduction of copper, and subsequently bronze, daggers could be made longer, leading to the sword. Thus, the development of the sword from the dagger was gradual, and in 2004 the first swords were claimed for the early Bronze Age, based on finds at Arslan Tepe by Marcella Frangipane of Rome University. A cache of 9 swords and daggers was found. They are composed of arsenic copper alloy. Among them, 3 swords were beautifully inlaid with silver. These are the weapons of a total length of 45 to 60 centimeters, which could be described as either short swords or long daggers. Some other similar swords have been found in Turkey, and are described by Thomas Zimmermann. The sword remained extremely rare for another millennium, and became more widespread only with the closing of the third millennium. The swords of this later period can still readily be interpreted as daggers, as with the copper specimen from Naxos, with a length of just below 36 centimeters, but individual specimens of the Cycladic copper swords of the period around 2300 reach a length up to 60 centimeters. The first weapons that can be classified as swords without any ambiguity are those found in Minoan Crete, dated to about 1700 BC, which reach lengths of more than 100 centimeters. These are the type A swords of the Aegean Bronze Age. Aegean. The Minoan and Mycenaean swords are classified in types labeled A to H following Sanders. The Sanders typology. Types A and B are the earliest from about the 17th to 16th centuries. Types C and D from the 15th century. Types E and F from the 13th and 12th. The 13th to 12th centuries also see a revival of the horned type, classified as types G and H. Type H swords are associated with the Sea peoples and were found in Anatolia and Greece. Contemporary with type C to H is the so-called NAUE2 type, imported from southeastern Europe. NAUE2, one of the most important and longest-lasting types of prehistoric European swords was the NAUE2 type, also known as Griffzungenschwert or Griptung sword. It first appears in c. the 13th century BC in northern Italy, and survived well into the Iron Age, with a lifespan of about 7 centuries, until the 6th century BC. During its lifetime, metallurgy changed from bronze to iron, but not its basic design. NAUE2 swords were exported from Europe to the Aegean, and as far afield as Ugarit, beginning about 1200 BC, just a few decades before the final collapse of the palace cultures in the Bronze Age collapse. NAUE2 swords could be as long as 85 centimeters, but most specimens fall into the 60 to 70 centimeters range. Swords from the Nordic Bronze Age appear from California. The 13th century BC are often showing characteristic spiral patterns. The early Nordic swords are also comparatively short. A specimen discovered in 1912 in near Bragby, Uppland, Sweden, dated to about 1800 to 1500 BC, was just over 60 centimeters long. This sword was, however, classified as of the Hajrusumsen Napier type, and was presumably imported. The Vretagloster sword discovered in 1897 has a blade length of 46 centimeters. A typical variant for European swords is the leaf-shaped blade, which was most common in northwest Europe at the end of the Bronze Age. On the British Isles in particular, the carp-stung sword is a type of bronze sword that was common to Western Europe during California, the 9th to 8th centuries BC. The blade of the carp-stung sword was wide and parallel for most of its length, but the final third narrowed into a thin tip intended for thrusting. The design was probably developed in northwestern France and combined the broad blade useful for slashing with a thinner, elongated tip suitable for thrusting. Its advantage is sword's adoption across Atlantic Europe. In Britain, the metalwork in the southeast derived its name from this sword, the carp-stung complex. Notable examples of this type were part of the Iron Horde. The Bronze Age-style sword and construction methods die out at the end of the early Iron Age, around 600–500 BC, when swords are once again replaced by daggers in most of Europe. An exception is the xiphos from Greece, the development of which continues for several more centuries. The antenna sword is a type of the late Bronze Age, continued in early iron swords of the East Hallstatt Italy region. China. Sword production in China is attested from the Bronze Age Shang dynasty, from roughly 1200 BC. The technology for bronze swords reached its high point during the Warring States period and Qin dynasty. Amongst the Warring States period swords, some unique technologies were used, such as casting height-in edges over softer, lower-tin cores, or the application of diamond-shaped patterns on the blade. Also unique for Chinese bronzes is the consistent use of high-tin bronze, which is very hard and breaks if stressed too far, whereas other cultures preferred lower-tin bronze, which bends if stressed too far. Although iron swords were made alongside bronze, it wasn't until the early Han dynasty that iron completely replaced bronze, making China the last place where bronze was used in swords. India. Swords have been recovered in archaeological findings of the ochre-colored pottery culture throughout the Ganges-Yamuna-Doaba region of India, commonly made of copper, but in some instances made of bronze. Diverse specimens have been discovered in Fatehgarh, where there are several varieties of hill. These swords have been variously dated to periods between 1700 to 1400 BC, but were probably used more extensively during 1200 to 600 BC.